Hello, Kristen.
Hi, Bill. How are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm doing all right. It's been a while.
Yes, I was on vacation last week. You've been a busy bee earlier in the month.
I have. Between getting stuck in airports, and I think I've flown between D.C. and Phoenix now 3 times since I last did a blogging, and so plenty of flying back and forth across the country.
So you're probably used to the current weather then if you've been in Phoenix earlier in the month.
Oh, yeah. I was in Phoenix the weekend before the first big, dust storm thing when it was, breaking records. It was, 117. But I would take that 117 over this 100, the D.C. East Coast. Ugh, it's so gross.
the Arizona heat's the dry heat.
Yeah, I actually didn't. I mean, you feel like you're inside a hairdryer, but it's not as bad as what's going on right now. So I hope everybody stay safe. If you're watching Blogging Heads right now, I hope you're watching it indoors. Stay hydrated.
Well, what's really hot are the debt limit talks in Washington.
But how was that for a transition?
So we're taping this, late Thursday. Who knows what the news is going to be by Friday? But as far as what the blogosphere has been talking about up until this point, I take it from the left and the right, broad derision of what the Gang of Six has done to reignite talk of a grand bargain. What are conservative bloggers saying about what from most of the left thinks is largely a conservative deal?
Well, yeah, the knives are out on this one. So I would say one of the primary bloggers that's been doing the most on this Gang of Six issue is Keith Hennessy, former from the Bush administration. And he loves digging into these, what does this piece of legislation mean sorts of topics. And so he kicked it off first with a post all about what is the Gang of Six plan. And he gives everybody fair warning, this is going to be kind of a rough post, and digs through, here's what the first piece means, here's what the second piece means, here's what the third piece means. Because it's my understanding the Gang of Six plan is sort of a 3-phase deal. And then follows it up. And that post is pretty neutral. He's not really offering any derision of the plan. He's just explaining the plan. He then follows it up with, here's why I oppose the Gang of Six plan. He says, I strongly oppose the Gang of Six plan. I think it's absolutely terrible fiscal policy. He flags a few things he likes in the plan. He likes making the technical correction to CPI, which right now the way that the government sort of indexes to inflation is the consumer price index, and that sometimes overestimates what inflation is. So there's a measure called change CPI that usually estimates lower inflation than just regular CPI.
This is a huge issue from the liberal interpretation of the Gang of Six. We'll get to that in a second.
Yeah, and so for the most part, this is not, what this does is it's supposedly kind of creates a sort of tax increase. I mean, it's sort of poorly described, but it's even something that, Reihan Salam, for instance, at National Review. Well, there's sort of 2 bloggers at National Review that have been writing about this, Reihan Salam and James Capretta. And James Capretta, he says, quote, Republicans must understand that even in this small initial part of the package, the Democrats are insisting on a tax hike. The change CPI proposal will increase taxes along with slowing inflation increases in Social Security. And then Reihan comes back and says he thinks that adopting the change CPI is a good idea. And that's what a few bloggers have said, that they like the idea, even if it does ultimately mean a little bit of a tax increase, it's better to have an accurate reading of inflation than to sort of artificially have the wrong reading, just for the sake of it being a little bit lower. However, what Keith Hennessy in his Why I Oppose the Gang of Six plan says, he says it's an unfair deal on CPI. He'd prefer that if we were raising more taxes off this new change CPI measure, that it go into cutting tax rates overall. But he says, those on the left would rather spend that deficit reduction on, change the deficit. Blech. Those on the left would like to spend the deficit reduction from slower Social Security spending growth on their priorities. I think the legislatively balanced way to do CPI is to do neither. So neither cut rates nor spend it on addressing the Social Security side. He said all the fiscal benefits of a CPI correction must go into deficit reduction. Treat it like it is, a technical correction to more accurately measure inflation. It is not a policy change, and therefore none of its effects should be mitigated. So that's the one issue on which there has been a little bit of a divide of conservative bloggers, some saying this is just a hidden tax increase, and others saying it's a technical correction. We'll let that slide so long as the revenue benefits you gain from it aren't being offset. You can't just get the tax benefits and not the other side. So James Capretta also declared, he has a post at the corner, Gang of Six disaster, the worst plan so far. Confusion among congressional Republicans about their objectives in the debt limit endgame has increased the possibility that they will stumble into a policy and political disaster over the next 2 weeks. And he says, now comes along the Gang of Six plan, and some Republicans are apparently intrigued by it. They shouldn't be. It's a terrible, terrible plan. They talk again about the first part of the bill. That's the $500 billion that's immediately saved through a combination of discretionary spending caps, the change CPI, repeal of the Class Act. But they say it's the second part of the package that's far worse. And the big hang up there is that the deal requires $2.3 trillion in increased revenue, which they say, oh, well, we want to lower marginal rates, but get rid of some of these tax expenditures, and so that's what'll create the additional revenue. So it depends on if your point of view is, I'm okay with lowering marginal rates, even if it means ultimately the government is taking more money from somewhere, or if you're the kind of person that says, lower marginal rates, and if you're going to get rid of tax expenditures, make it neutral. I don't want the government taking in more money, period. And the other big point of contention is that the deal would request, or would say, we need $2.3 trillion in additional revenue over this time frame, but that the budget committee can't say how that money is created. So it's sort of left to a democratically controlled committee, the Senate Finance Committee, to come up with the nuts and bolts. And so conservatives are saying, why are we trusting this plan when so many important pieces of it aren't actually going to be in the plan? They're things we're sort of trusting that will be pieces of legislation created later on by Democratic committees and folks who aren't necessarily involved in the Gang of Six. That's a major piece of why folks are concerned.
But do you think that in the conservative blogosphere, there would be some kind of specified package of revenue raisers that they would say, oh, well, if it's these revenue raisers, well, then we're okay with this. It's only that there's a prospect of some other nefarious package they wouldn't like. I mean, isn't it just that it has revenue raisers at all is the problem for them?
Well, I mean, the idea that if the government is somehow taking in more money than it would otherwise, yeah, that's viewed as a tax increase. It's viewed as, this is bad, this is taking money out of the hands of private citizens, this is not what we need in this economy. I mean, sort of your basic traditional conservative argument against why we don't want to raise taxes, period. What I think is interesting is actually you could make a supply-sider argument that, you could get that $2.3 trillion in revenue if you cut taxes. Did Larry
Kudlow make that case?
Well, I mean, I think that I'm certain that that's not exactly how the Democratic Senate Finance Committee would pursue it. But certainly by that argument, then, if you're saying you're going to do things to raise revenues in a way that CBO scores it, because again, CBO doesn't score things with a supply-sider mentality. They don't do the dynamic, like making assumption scoring. They just say, you raise taxes by X amount, here's how much more you're going to be bringing in. So I think the assumption there is somehow, some way, they're going to have to make these numbers match up so that when CBO scores it, CBO finds $2.3 trillion in extra money. That's money that's going to come from somewhere, and which therefore makes it a tax increase, which therefore makes it objectionable.
So you're having now Eric Erickson at Red State try to, as he is generally wont to do, appoint himself as the grassroots army general, putting pressure on House Republicans to stay away from this deal. And they sent out an email alert today, breaking news from Red State. And the message that he's putting out is, hold the freaking line. And is there a sense in Washington that Red State and the conservative blogosphere in general have the muscle to do that? Are they being listened to in this debate and saying, if this isn't making Eric Erickson happy, then we can't do it?
I think that there are some freshman members who believe that they were elected to do, that they were elected on a certain policy mandate. There's actually a really interesting piece that Jay Cost at the Weekly Standard wrote on Wednesday, 4 historical lessons for the Republican House. And his first point is that midterm mandates are provisional. That it's sort of a lesson that some of these new conservative Republican members, they believe they were elected on a mandate to cut spending. And what Jay's post says is, it's difficult, impossible really, to conclude that the public elected any president or any Congress with a specific policy mandate. Instead, the best approach to viewing elections is that of an opportunity to build a mandate over time. Policies and programs should be implemented with a view toward growing and sustaining popular support. This is where both the 80th Congress and the 104th Congress went astray. Both assumed, incorrectly, that their mandates were a signal of substantial sea changes in the body politic, and this misinterpretation induced the GOP in both instances to extend itself beyond the limits of public approval, ultimately giving the opposition an electoral advantage. I think there's real concern now that if we do get a good deal, there are some members that have said they're not voting for anything that raises the debt limit, even if it doesn't have, the dollar for dollar. I mean, there's in a post by Ed Morrissey over at Hot Air, he points out that Paul Brown is one of the members. He sounds a dissent. I gave my word to my constituents in Georgia and to the rest of the American people that I would not vote for any bill that increases the debt limit. Although the cut, cap, and balance bill is a step in the right direction, it still raises the debt ceiling by $2.4 trillion, and we simply cannot afford it. So this is a conservative Republican who did not vote for cut, cap, and balance because it includes a debt limit raise. So I think there's starting to be some concern that there's enough belief that there's this strong policy mandate, and surely I do believe that Americans, strongly want to see America get away from its pattern of deficit spending. They'd like to see fiscal restraint. They'd like to see the government balancing itself, and they don't really want to see higher taxes. I mean, I've seen data that bears all that out. What does concern me is if we get offered a deal, or if we come up with a deal that does include, say, even some nominal trade-offs. We want spending cuts here. We don't want you to don't mess around with marginal rates, or even if maybe lower them a little. But then here are a few of these little token deductions to get rid of. I think if it winds up being revenue neutral, I think that Republicans maybe ought to take a hard look at that deal. And I think there's concern among folks, for instance, Jay Cost, that might not be the case. I actually had a piece that I don't often get to say, I had a piece I blogged this week. I don't get to do the self-promotion thing, but I had a piece at New York Times Room for Debate earlier this week.
That rag.
Yeah, that's silly paper. Where I said that the Americans in general, I think, are not paying attention to this extremely closely, in that, you and I are trying to figure out what is in the Gang of Six plan. I'm sure my family back in Orlando is not. I'm sure they're saying, I just want Congress to fix this. What is going on? They all sound like a bunch of children. And so, I think if the debt ceiling ultimately gets raised and there's like a doomsday scenario that is averted, I think people will sort of roll their eyes, say Washington continues to be broken, and they'll go on with their daily lives. And they'll go back to worrying about jobs and the economy, which is the top issue. But I think that if the debt ceiling is not raised, and if some kind of doomsday scenario plays out, even if it's just for a day, if people have one day of looking at their retirement portfolio and it has cratered, if it's lost 15% of its value in a day because the market panics, I think people will remember that. And even if they hold both Republicans and Obama responsible, what's challenging there is this is Obama's economy now, and so a lot of his job approval ratings are being held down by the fact that the economy is in such bad shape, or that the recovery is not going the way folks had hoped. If suddenly something happens where the economy takes a hit, even if temporarily, because of this debt limit debate, Obama will no doubt make the case, this isn't just my economy anymore. Republicans have done this as well. And that's tough, because for Republicans, the best thing they have going for them right now is the fact that the Obama administration has this albatross around its neck of the unemployment rate. If it is perceived that Republicans and Democrats together are the reason for some sort of economic disruption a month, 2 months down the road, that winds up, I think, being a net positive for Obama because shared blame is better than him being solely responsible for the state of the economy.
Well, I would imagine any kind of serious market panic has perhaps unpredictable ripple effects.
Right.
And certainly it would seem from polling now that Republicans would take a good chunk of that, the lion's share of the blame for that. Its after effects on the economy, are unknown. And it would seem that no one in the upper echelons of power in either party want to roll the dice with it. Which is why you have the McConnell plan of giving the president the ability to raise the debt ceiling, essentially unilaterally, and Boehner speaking somewhat favorably towards it. Is there anything on the right to say that is preferable to a deal where we'd have to actually raise some revenue at all?
I think that any time that I've ever seen a conservative commentator or a blogger post that, don't raise the debt limit. If it's doomsday, it's doomsday. It's always paired with but we don't think it's going to be doomsday. It's always paired with we'll just cut discretionary spending. We'll cut spending except for on Social Security and the mandatory stuff. And then this will force government into a contraction, but we won't actually default. We'll continue to make our payments. We'll continue to pay Social Security, and everything else will get slashed. And there's a really good post by Megan McArdle at The Atlantic where she kind of debunks this and says, okay, conservatives who believe this isn't going to be bad, this is not Y2K. What do you intend to cut spending on? Are we going to cut military pay? Is it going to mean that nobody's watching our nuclear arsenal? So what exactly of this discretionary spending do you propose gets cut first in this really, really, really tight contraction where we have to make things work in order to avoid deficit? I think that it's most of the time when you see folks saying don't take a deal, it's because they are also saying because we don't think it's that big a deal if we don't raise the debt.
Well, and this is sort of the problem that the Republican Party has found itself in. They have electionally a number of folks who are impervious to reality and to facts. So even when you have a relative adult like John Boehner say, okay, look, I'm telling you privately, this is really going to be an economic apocalypse. We don't want it on our watch. We just play ball here. He doesn't have the stature to bring those folks along. And I think what we don't know is to what extent, how many of those people really are in the Republican caucus. I thought there were a lot more of them before the last impasse we had regarding government shutdown, and Boehner was able to get the bulk of his caucus to avert a government shutdown. So we hear the voices of those who are being, debt limit deniers right now, but we don't really know if they are truly the majority of the Republican caucus and would, at the end of the day, block any sort of deal from happening. It's all
my sense is no. My sense is that's actually not a very large portion. I don't think that there are, that a majority of the Republicans in Congress believe that it's not a big deal if we don't raise the debt ceiling. What I found actually really interesting, and this isn't from the last week, this is a little bit older, but after the first big grand bargain sort of fell apart, and you had Obama give remarks, you had Boehner give remarks, is that for a consistent day, anywhere I turned on cable news or any remarks I heard, it was Democrats saying, we believe John Boehner is really, he's a smart guy, he wants to play ball, but he has some crazy people that he's trying to deal with. And it kept trying to drive this wedge almost. They would really praise Boehner and then, bash on all the Republicans. And I couldn't help but think, if you guys really want a deal, why are you trying to drive a wedge between the speaker and his caucus? Because ultimately, he's the one that's going to have to shake people down and get them to vote for whatever this compromise is. And they're already a little skeptical, given that, the government shutdown bargain wound up some of the cuts were kind of, number fudging. He's going to have to be the one to convince these people, trust me, come with me on this bargain that I have carved with this president that you greatly distrust. So I feel like driving that wedge more does not actually help you get to a debt limit compromise. I feel like it's just sort of a needless political complication. I always wondered what the Democrats' strategy was on that one.
this very much goes both ways.
Oh yeah.
It's not like Republicans have been all nice to Democrats.
Well, no, and I'm not criticizing. I'm not saying that Democrats, shouldn't have. Of course, Democrats are going to criticize Republicans. Republicans criticize Democrats. What I thought was weird was this strategy of trying to separate Boehner out from his caucus, of like lavishing praise on him. That he's trying. He's a good guy. We believe he has integrity. He wants to make a deal work. It's a shame his caucus doesn't. And I thought that's so odd that it's as if they're trying to make it seem like Boehner's like a secret Democrat. Like Republicans don't trust him. He's on our team. Like it just seemed like it seemed like it's not helping Boehner, get the cover that he needs in order to make a deal.
It's hard to read, I think, the internal calculations of this sort of thing. There's clearly a fair amount of stuff that goes on that is straight up posturing, and what goes on privately is not in sync with the public statements. And there's a degree of doing that because while everyone knows that a deal is very likely, both parties obviously want to come out PR-wise with the edge on the deal, and therefore lots of digs are thrown and attempts to weaken the other side occur, and so one side is seen as getting the final arm twist in. So there is. I agree with you. There's a tension there between wanting to get the deal in a economic apocalypse and splitting the Republican caucus, weakening leadership position, making the Republicans look like they're not serious and are in disarray. But I think both parties do that quite significantly, we won't know until the deal, if and when it gets done, to what extent it was truly an impediment to getting the deal done.
I think it's always funny. It seems as though Democrats more often than not nowadays are trying to make Republicans seem more in disarray than they are. And I think Republicans often make the opposite move where we try to make it seem as though all of the Democrats are in this like groupthink hive mind where I'm sure you would say like trying to get all these Democrats to agree on anything is nearly impossible. Which I guess leads me to what are the Democrats, the bloggers on the left's main concerns with the Gang of Six plan?
Well, certainly I think the vast majority of liberal bloggers are extremely antagonistic towards the Gang of Six, always have been. They've always hated any of these attempts at cosmetic centrism for the reason that they think that the cosmetic centrism would lead to a deal that would be heavily weighted to an anti-government, anti-tax stance, and that's how a lot of folks view this deal as. But because a lot of the elements are so sketchy, you're seeing a lot of focus on what you mentioned before, this whole Social Security chain CPI deal, which was already zeroed in on by the Strengthened Social Security Coalition. And from the liberal perspective, this is a benefit cut masquerading as a technical correction. Nancy Altman, who's part of the Social Security Coalition, posted on the ourfuture.org blog, which is the Campaign for America's Future blog, which I'm associated with. Her headline was, Gang of Six plan cuts Social Security now and devastates it later, talking about how as the change in the cost of living adjustment as it impacts over time means deeper and deeper cuts until you get to $1,000 benefit cut for people once they turn 85 years old, and a pretty major loss of income for folks while healthcare costs currently are on the rise, and those things aren't reflected necessarily in the cost of living adjustment. So, that has always been the big fear with a lot of folks on the left with Obama, that he was actually serious about trying to reform Social Security, and that he would do so in a way that would make it a stingier program and undercut its popularity. That's always been the big fear. Digby similarly, referring to Digby's comment, the one aspect of the left which is counter to that is led by Ezra Klein, who's blogging at the Washington Post, and certainly coming from a relatively moderate position, arguing that the Gang of Six plan is essentially the best that can be done in the current political environment and therefore should be acceptable. He wrote, I wrote a column recently arguing that in retrospect, the Simpson-Bowles plan was a pretty good deal. It was more balanced on both the spending and the tax side than the president's April deficit reduction proposal. That is truer now than it was then, and truer in the Gang of Six bill than in that bill. The Gang of Six bill, for instance, appears to jettison the Simpsons-Bowler recommendation that tax revenues be capped at 21% of GDP. That argument is certainly being put out there by some folks, and Digby took a whack at that notion, saying, excuse me here. I think that it's referred to Ezra Klein's post. I think that about says it all. This has become the new middle ground and includes devastating cuts to Social Security, the worst of which would fall upon women in their most geriatric years, and disabled people who depend upon SSI, more cuts to Medicare, and likely a devastating blow to Medicaid. Criticize the notion that Ezra is doing, treating this as middle ground when it should be treated as a very conservative proposal. So that's where you have a lot of high anxiety on the left now around this, although we don't actually know to what extent the president fully embraces the deal. We know he said nice general things about it, and he's trying to use it as an argument to say that we can do a deal that includes revenue increases, which has always been the one clear red line that he has drawn throughout all of this. We don't actually know for a fact if he is embracing the Social Security portion of this or not. We just because he's always spoken in generalities about it. But the fact he's even giving it rhetorical love is enough to send a lot of liberal bloggers over the edge.
One of the things that I'm wondering, I think it's a part of the Gang of Six plan, which is something that conservatives have said that they are not a fan of, is that with the change CPI provision, that there's also supposedly something that would therefore, it would sort of be like a patch for it for the lowest income recipients of Social Security, so that it would actually wind up sort of increase, you'd have the CPI, the change CPI, but it would sort of be a patch so that the lowest income folks wouldn't be impacted. And that's something
this is always the Simpsons-Bowles model as well, to make that rhetorical case. Hey, we're not going to hurt the poor people. We'll protect them from all these changes. But the retort on the left has always been that's not the same as saying you're going to protect the middle class. And what you're arguing to be the wealthy really is a much bigger net than that. And this cuts to a much more fundamental discussion of what Social Security is. And what a lot of Social Security defenders has argued, one of the reasons why it's been so popular for so long is that there isn't a sense that it is a welfare program, that it's heavily skewed based on income level, that there's a general sense of you put your money in and you get your money back at the end of the day, even though I don't think it's a literal truth. There's certainly plenty of aspects of the formula which do adjust things based on income level. It's not so dramatic that people feel like it's an income transfer. There are liberals in FDR's day that didn't want him to do a payroll tax model for this because it wasn't a progressive tax, and FDR countered by saying, no, you do it this way. It's not. No one's going to want to touch it. It's going to seem like everyone has their own special account, and that political argument has proven true. So there's a big fear among Social Security defenders that once you get into anything that is along the lines of mean testing, that is going to weaken the popularity of the program and leave it vulnerable to further attacks in the future.
Sort of interesting flip on the notion that Republicans are the ones who always want to keep the money in the pockets of the wealthy. Well, hey, I think, in a week or two, I hope that we are back on this program discussing whatever the final deal was, and that economic apocalypse has been averted. Over the last month, I read The Big Short by Michael Lewis, and I'm now having nightmares about fiscal meltdown or financial meltdowns. And so let's just hope next time you and I have this show that there's been some sort of resolution that will likely make both of our respective bloggers profoundly unhappy.
Just in case, let's store some provisions in the back.
I'm telling you what, after I finished that book, I was like, I'm building a basement, getting canned goods. I'm going to start filling it because eventually something's going to go wrong. Anyways, I don't mean to be, nihilistic on this, but it's a terrifying book if you've never read it. Anyhow, should we move to the next topic?
Sure, and less apocalyptic news. I would think probably the one thing that maybe has tempered liberal reaction towards the Gang of Six is the festival of Schadenfreude that there's been around Rupert Murdoch's predicament, and watching him go under the Klieg lights in England, that has led forth a burst of activity in liberal blogosphere, I think, in hopes of perhaps toppling the entire News Corps regime, because obviously Murdoch is seen by folks on the left as being the heartbeat of conservative media infrastructure that has bedeviled the left for over a decade. And there are a couple of ways where this is played out. One is just simply analyzing the hearing itself. I think there's always a notion that the extent that you're putting attention to it is a way to keep the story alive. And Laura Clausen at Daily Kos, speculated on would Murdoch possibly face jail time for all this. You had Digby talking about how maybe there's a split in the family, and that Rupert's "I don't know anything" defense was perhaps a subtle way to put more burden on his son James and force him to explain his involvement. But you also had an attempt to add to the story by blogger Joe Rahm, who blogs for Center for American Progress's climate blog, Climate Progress, and in partnership with Keith Olbermann in his new perch at Current TV, where they did a joint post talking about how the old ClimateGate attempted scandal, where the emails of climate scientists were stolen via hackery and put out of context. And at this point, everyone knows that there was no actual scandal there, and the data behind global warming remains sound. It certainly put a lot of climate scientists on the defensive for a very long time. They've actually made at least a circumstantial connection between that attempt and the current hacking scandal. Namely, that there was one gentleman who has a role in both, and we don't know exactly. His name's Neil Wallace, and Neil Wallace has been arrested, and it was revealed that he was acting as a double agent for Scotland Yard and Rupert Murdoch, while also consulting David Cameron, the Great Britain's Prime Minister. Consulting with him during the 2010 election, and so there's that stuff that we know. They point out that he was actually hired by the climate scientists to do their PR during after that hacking happened, and they suggest that perhaps that he intentionally did an awful job because he actually had. He was playing a similar double agent type role, and that's just speculation on their part. But they're just really trying to encourage more investigation towards it. So I have no idea if there's something there or not, but just an example of the attention the left is putting on it and hoping to build an even more comprehensive case that could really pierce the strength of News Corp and the broader conservative media infrastructure.
Excellent. Interesting. Well, I mean, there's probably a lot more about this on the left than there is on the right. I think in the same way that talking about the story keeps it alive, I think there's not a great deal of incentive for bloggers on the right to talk about this at length. But the posts that I have seen, sort of, most of them fall into one camp, although there's another post that I think has a very insightful take on it. The first one is Mike McNally at Pajamas Media, I think, has a post that summarizes most of what I've read, which is that, liberals are giddily anticipating a world without Fox. They're getting a little ahead of themselves. Reports suggest that FBI investigators don't think there's much substance to allegations that journalists working for News of the World, the now defunct UK tabloid at the center of the scandal, plotted to hack the phones of 9/11 victims and their families. Anything, of course, is possible with fresh revelations coming out almost daily, but if the 9/11 investigation fizzles out, it'll be hard for the Murdoch-hating left to keep Americans interested in the hacking scandal. So, let me stop you right there because I didn't mention this. There's another allegation that came out previously that perhaps
some of the phones of the 9/11 victims' families were hacked, and even some Congress people were suggesting that they should hold hearings to pursue those allegations, and so we don't know if those are fully true yet or not, but that's what that post is referring to.
Yeah, and there was also, this isn't referring to this, but for some reason I thought that I'd heard there were allegations that some celebrities, like Jude Law, that his phone had been hacked when he was in the United States, and so maybe that would therefore incur some sort of need for a U.S. investigation. But at any rate, then the post then goes through all of the various sort of enemies of Rupert Murdoch and why they have a very vested interest in making a big deal about this being him personally responsible for these illegal actions. And in this blogger's case, he tries to make the case that The Guardian ran away with information that was obtained illegally when it would publish things that had been stolen by WikiLeaks. And so, is it, some publications are okay using stuff that's illegally obtained if it suits their agenda and they like it, versus if it's something that they can say is morally reprehensible. So that's the case that some bloggers have been making, that it's a double standard. I find Meghan McArdle's take to be one that I personally agree with. She says, her post, Murdoch in the Dock, what does it all mean? She says, it's a great deal of personal malice toward Rupert Murdoch that is based on his politics and his success at advancing those politics, not at what seems to be fairly widespread corruption in the British press. On the other hand, the company thoroughly earned whatever it gets, so you won't catch me complaining about the unfairness of it all. That News Corp sort of, if in fact these allegations all wind up being true, yes, News of the World and News Corp absolutely deserve to get raked over the coals for breaking laws. But on the other hand, a lot of the giddiness over this isn't outrage that some sort of journalistic ethics were breached, but rather it's, haha, look, Rupert Murdoch, proof that he is actually as evil as we said he is. So, to which she sort of shrugs her shoulders and says,
Oh, I think that's certainly, as far as the folks on the left that are trying to stoke this in the U.S., that is certainly true. It is not simply that there is outrage about the illegal hacking. It's that they want to see Rupert Murdoch toppled, and not just for laughs.
Well,
they see Rupert Murdoch as being a major impediment to progressive politics.
Well, and what the rest of the McArdle piece says that I think is also really insightful is she says, the very thing that makes liberals hate Fox News, its slant, its large audience, makes it impossible to kill, even if you destroyed the network. Some other cable network would buy up most of its talent and move into its niche, with an audience that would be even more fanatically loyal thanks to the vast left-wing conspiracy that killed their beloved news channel. And she also goes in, she says that she believes that the company's breakup value is estimated at twice the value of the individual properties. So, she doesn't actually think, even if you got rid of Rupert Murdoch, she doesn't think that means the end of News Corp or the end of Fox News. So that may be wishful thinking on the part of.
And that's a very astute point, that there's some social dynamics in place. Vacuums will be filled no matter what. But there may also be a hope here. I mean, I would argue that conservative media plays things fast and loose on a lot of fronts, and have been able to do it without a lot of repercussions. And here is a case where there might be very significant repercussions. And to the point that I forget which blogger that you just mentioned, who said, well, these Guardian reporters don't care if things are illegally obtained when it comes to their own stories. I mean, there's a difference between information that was illegally obtained and that was given to you, and breaking the law yourself directly. And I think investigative reporters often are happy to get their hands on information however they can get them, short of actively breaking the law themselves. And even in the case where perhaps somebody did break the law themselves, that's not an argument for saying you shouldn't be brought before a court of law if that occurs. So there'd be an indirect effect to say, you can't fly this close to the sun anymore. Even if a conservative media were still exist, perhaps they'd have to behave differently if this came to light. But again, perhaps there's no connection between not being allowed to hack phones anymore and putting out misinformation about budgets in Texas. They could be totally separate things.
See, I don't view this as ideological. I mean, another quote, I keep going back to the same Meghan McArdle piece because I liked it so much. She says, on the other, the Murdoch scandal mostly unfolded while it's tied up with other writing. As far as I can tell, at least one subsidiary of News Corp admittedly did something very, very wrong. On the other hand, virtually all British tabloids have been known to do the same, pretty much the same, all British tabloids have been known to have been doing pretty much the same wrong thing for a very, very long time. Remember poor Prince Charles and the tampon remark. So it makes it difficult for me to credit this new wave of outrage as being purely motivated by a breach of journalistic ethics. That it's not, I wouldn't say it's something that's, I would definitely not say it's something that's like endemic to, or inherently something that conservative media does, is that they're okay with breaking the law, whereas more liberal media outlets are all about being above board. I think that attempts to make this seem as though this was rooted in a conservative bias on the part of news.
We don't know completely yet, but if you read the piece that the head of The Guardian wrote for Newsweek, which talks about how long they've been pursuing this story, how they had run several stories about this for a while and nobody really cared. And it wasn't until they broke the story about the girl who was murdered, whose phone was hacked, giving false hope to the parents, that this really took off. But there is this larger web of intrigue between Murdoch papers, the police in England, and the conservative government, which makes it a little more than just the type of stuff that tabloids did involving Prince Charles.
Didn't a lot of this happen when conservatives weren't in charge, however? I mean, that's another thing that I've been struck by, is it seems as though like this is being portrayed as some sort of conspiracy between David Cameron and News Corp, when, if I'm not mistaken, David Cameron hasn't been prime minister for this, during the time that all of this hacking was going on. So I think that, too, is a little bit overplaying.
One of the key figures was his spokesperson.
Yeah, he was, brought on later to be his spokesperson. So, and he's obviously getting a lot of tough questions. But I think to allege that this is some inherent, conservative government or conservative media scandal, I think applies an ideological label to something that is much less about ideology and much more about a news organization that just did some terrible stuff in order to get a scoop on some stories.
Unanswered questions.
Yes, indeed. Speaking of conservative news organizations, the next story is the Michele Bachmann migraine story, which has caused quite a bit of consternation on the right.
There's someone in your party that does not want Michele Bachmann to be president.
Well, I think that the Daily Caller has actually been, so the Daily Caller is run by Tucker Carlson, positioned itself sort of as a conservative-leaning HuffPo, but it's not really just an aggregator. They have a lot of investigative journalists on staff, and have the capacity to, I believe, do some good investigative work. And Matt Lewis, the other This Week in blogger, works for the Daily Caller. So I'd be interested to hear what his take on all this is. But in this case, the Daily Caller sometimes breaks stories that, go after the heart of the left or try to prove hypocrisy. I believe it was the Daily Caller that was at the heart of Dave Weigelgate, proving that he was, not suited to be the blogger about the conservative world for the Washington Post. That was one Jonathan Strong scoop. Another Jonathan Strong scoop was about the Bondage Club RNC expenditure. So, Jonathan Strong has this track record at the Daily Caller of sort of bringing to light these stories that always ruffle some feathers. Sometimes people think there really wasn't a story here. You made it into a story, and, there were consequences when this wasn't actually as big a deal as you made it to be. And it seems as though conservatives are now rather upset with the treatment that Bachmann got in this story. You had Michelle Malkin, who posted on Wednesday the migraine maelstrom. So anyhow, to explain for folks who don't necessarily know, the Daily Caller ran a story about Michele Bachmann. This is from an Ed Morrissey post. Daily Caller's Jonathan Strong drops a bombshell on the Michele Bachmann campaign today with a report that migraines incapacitate the presidential hopeful on a regular basis. The headline also alleges heavy pill use, a loaded phrase that insinuates some sort of addiction, an insinuation that the story then fails to support. And goes on, basically to say that this is really atrocious, that the story uses a ton of unnamed sources to try to make it almost seem like she's, drug addicted and could never be president of the United States because she's always being incapacitated by these migraines, when anything stressful happens. And Michele Bachmann wrote, what a singularly ridiculous brouhaha the Beltway press has stirred up about GOP Representative Michele Bachmann's migraine. It's even sadder that the Daily Caller, which has some terrific investigative reporters like Matthew Boyle on staff, initiated this specious attack. Bachmann was forced to release a doctor's note about her condition, a condition that some 30 million Americans share. My 2 cents, I'd much rather have a migraine sufferer in the White House than the current migraine inducer in chief. So conservative bloggers have by and large, rallied around Michele Bachmann to say, you know, whether you want her to be the nominee or not, this is a sort of ridiculous story to pursue to try to prove that she's somehow unfit.
I mean, I don't think this is just a question of the Daily Caller here, because obviously somebody gave it to the Daily Caller. Mm-hmm. It is, I think there's someone in the Republican Party apparatus that is looking to, throw a curveball to Bachmann. But you did have the Columbia Journalism Review echo what Michele Bachmann was saying, and saying that the Daily Caller now has a pattern of mountain out of molehill stories focusing on Jonathan Strong. And several of Strong pieces play into Ezra Klein calls a shell game. Leads target the media mainstream outlets, but go on to cite the more egregious comments of openly ideological publications like The Nation. So he's going on about the journalist story, Jeremiah Wright story. I'm sorry, I'm not doing a good job summarizing the Columbia Journalism Review piece on the fly. But essentially making that same point that there's a pattern of that sort of prankish story that has become a Daily Caller hallmark, and you can complain about that and say that it's unfair or whatnot, but it clearly is serving the Daily Caller's interests to make waves and draw people to their site. And
it's stories that other places aren't covering. So you could say that, okay, for instance, take the John Edwards Riel Hunter scandal. That was something that the National Enquirer was willing to run with, but other news organizations weren't ready to bring it up, weren't willing to talk about it. In a way, I assume that the Daily Caller and Jonathan Strong would make the case that he's willing to write stories that other news outlets don't think are worthy of time, but that wind up having these repercussions, whether it's Dave Weigel having to, leave Washington Post to move to Slate, or, people getting fired at the RNC, or, there are consequences when he writes these stories, even though they're stories that most other news outlets probably wouldn't touch or think are a big enough deal. But this is certainly something that is not just folks on the left, but also folks on the right now saying the Daily Caller has made a mountain out of a molehill and come after one of our own, and that's not right.
Well, I guess we don't know if this was shopped around to a bunch of other outlets that turned it down and they settled on the Caller, or has the Caller developed enough of a reputation for these types of stories that you can go to the Caller with this stuff with limited backup, just one person's anonymous account, and they're going to run with it, and it's going to break big to the point where it's really not that other news outlets don't care about the story now that it's out. ABC is saying their top investigative reporter on the trail and got roughed up by Bachmann staff in the process, and they've done follow-up stories, and Politico's done follow-up stories, and now it's a full-fledged thing.
I wonder if it's almost that the Daily Caller, once they run it, then it's no longer taboo for other news organizations to run after it. That if, say, ABC News had gotten wind of this and ran with this story, that it would be a concern that it would look bad on them for, going after Michele Bachmann on this health issue. Whereas once the Daily Caller has done it, yeah, you're not the first, but then you get to investigate it and just say, hey, we're just looking into a story that someone else raised, and you kind of get that sort of moral cover.
I mean, I would not discount that, but I also don't think that there is such a high-mindedness in the traditional media these days that they would totally turn their nose at any sort of story like this. I mean, I think everyone's happy to get the ratings wherever they can, so I didn't see that ABC was doing this under duress. They seem to throw themselves into it quite eagerly. But there is some, debate on the left whether it's a mountain out of a molehill story. Ed Kilgore, the Democratic strategist, said, "I'm sympathetic to her on these specific issues. I used to half jokingly say we needed the constitutional amendment to ban public references to the families of politicians. So who cares what someone's gaydar says about Marcus Bachmann? And who cares whether his reportedly avantistic views of gay sexuality reflect hypocrisy or repressed desires or good old-fashioned ignorance? Aren't Michele Bachmann's own views on these subjects sufficient enough? I mean, it's talking different about the headache issue, but about these other side issues. As for so he goes on to say, as for the revelation of Bachmann's alleged disability and treatment for it, it's worth noting at this point that the author of the story, Jonathan Strong, has a bit of a history in this area. I can barely read this stuff without being deafened by the sound of axes being ground and its website hits being cynically generated. More importantly, Strong's account is much heavier on innuendo than facts. It's a bit hard to clear up the idea that Bachmann has been disappearing regularly for extended periods of time. She is, after all, rather conspicuous. And the supposed concerns of her staffers or the writer egging them on may simply reflect the ignorance of the young about how many medications it takes to treat migraines, for that matter. But you then have Kevin Drum over at Mother Jones taking the issue more seriously and saying, I don't think Bachmann's migraines have anything to do with her crazy ideas about how to run the country, but I do think that a condition that's potentially incapacitating during times of stress is very much an issue for a prospective president. We only learned about the fact about JFK's massive cocktail medical problems. That's probably just dumb luck that they never caused any serious problems. But it's not 1960 anymore. This might not be easy to explain, but it still needs to be explained. So, there's definitely a difference of thought on how serious an issue it is. My own personal attitude about it is, if you're going to ask one person to dump their entire private medical history for review by the public, you should do the same for everybody. It should be because one anonymous staffer popped off the Daily Caller means that she's the only person that has a potential health issue to discuss. I mean, we might not know about the other people's, although I'm perfectly happy keeping it all private and with the notion that if someone is incapacitated, that's why we have a constitution and a vice president and succession of powers and whatnot, and the Constitution can handle that fact. So I can look at it either way, but I come down on consistency and not doing it based on scuttlebutt.
Seems very reasonable of you.
Thank you very much. We've probably run a little bit long. Should we leave it on that note?
Yeah, let's leave it on that note.
Well, always good to talk to you. Check out Kristen's piece on the New York Times website. I don't think they've scrubbed it yet. I think it's still there.
Yep, I believe it is. I believe it's still up.
And we'll catch you next week on This Week in Blog.